Calm under pressure, the psychology of unshakable minds. Think of the last time pressure found you. Not the mild inconvenience of a delayed flight or a difficult conversation. The genuine pressure, the moment when the stakes were high, when something important was in the balance, when the outcome depended on the quality of your thinking and your behavior precisely at the moment when the pressure was making both most difficult. Think of that moment, and think of what happened inside you. For most people, the internal experience of genuine pressure follows a specific and recognizable pattern. The physiological activation first, the accelerated heart rate, the narrowing of peripheral vision, the specific urgency that the body produces when it has assessed the situation as demanding. Then the cognitive narrowing, the options that were available before the pressure arrived or suddenly less visible. The thinking has compressed. The ability to assess the full situation with the quality of processing that the situation requires has been partially replaced by the rapid, reactive, simplified processing that the activated state produces. And then, often, the behavior that the compressed processing generates, the reaction that does not quite fit the situation, the response that serves the activated state rather than the actual requirements of the moment. This pattern is nearly universal. It is the default human response to genuine pressure, but it is not inevitable. And the difference between the person whose behavior is governed by this pattern and the person who has built something different is not a matter of temperament, natural gift, or biological advantage. It is a matter of discipline, specifically developed, specifically trained, specifically practiced until it becomes the new default. Pressure does not create weakness, it reveals it. This statement contains the entire logic of what follows. If pressure revealed strength consistently, the goal would be to seek more of it and let it do its work. But pressure reveals what was already there. The person who breaks under pressure was already breakable. The pressure simply found the brakes. The person who holds under pressure was already built to hold. The pressure confirmed a capacity that already existed. The project of this audiobook is the specific development of what needs to be there in order for the pressure to reveal strength rather than weakness. The 10 chapters that follow are 10 sequential layers of a single developed quality, the psychological architecture of the unshakable mind built in the specific order that makes each layer the foundation of the next. By the end of this audiobook, the way you experience pressure, understand pressure, and respond to it will be meaningfully different. Not because the pressure will be less, because you will be more precisely calibrated to what pressure actually is and what it actually requires. More practiced in the specific cognitive and behavioral habits that keep the deliberate mind accessible when the activated state is driving toward its closure. More genuinely unshakable in the specific sense that this audiobook defines, not untouched by pressure, but not governed by it. Introduction. The architecture of the unshakable mind. The word unshakable is chosen with precision. It does not mean emotionless. It does not mean invulnerable. It does not describe the person who feels no pressure, experiences no activation, and moves through genuinely high-stakes situations with the ease of someone for whom nothing is at stake. That person does not exist, and the aspiration to become them is both unachievable and, if you think it through, undesirable. The complete absence of the activation response would remove important information and important motivation from the cognitive process. Unshakable means something specific and more practical, the quality of being fully activated by genuine pressure, feeling it completely. registering it accurately without being governed by the activation. The unshakable person experiences the pressure and continues to think clearly. They experience the emotional activation and continue to make choices from the deliberate mind rather than from the reactive one. They are moved by what genuinely warrants being moved by, and they are not moved from their fundamental quality of behavior and engagement by anything the pressure is producing. This architecture is built in the 10 chapters that follow. Each chapter addresses a specific layer of the capacity, a specific psychological mechanism of pressure response, and the specific discipline that governs it. The layers are sequential. Understanding why people break is the prerequisite for building what prevents it. Understanding what happens in the brain under stress is the prerequisite for the practices that maintain access to the deliberate mind during that stress. The architecture builds from the ground up. Chapter 1 begins with the honest understanding of what pressure actually does and what actually breaks. Chapter 1. Why most people break under pressure. Pressure does not create weakness, it reveals it. The question of why people break under pressure is not a question about the pressure. It is a question about the person. Pressure is an external condition. The stakes are high. The time is short. The outcome is uncertain. The consequences of error are significant. What breaks is not produced by these conditions alone. It is produced by the interaction between these conditions and the specific internal architecture that the person brings to them. Two people in identical pressure conditions will have entirely different experiences and produce entirely different behavioral outputs, because they are bringing different internal architectures to the same external situation. Understanding the specific features of the internal architecture that breaks, what it consists of, how it fails, and why the failure is so consistent and predictable is the prerequisite for building the architecture that holds. You cannot replace what you do not understand. The most fundamental feature of the breaking architecture is the self-inept dependency on external conditions. The person whose sense of themselves, their worth, their competence, their adequacy is primarily determined by how the external situation is going is in a condition of fundamental vulnerability to pressure. Because pressure is precisely the condition in which the external situation is most likely to be going badly, or uncertainly, or in a direction they cannot control. When the external situation is the primary input to the self-inept, and the pressure situation is the situation in which those inputs are most threatening, the self-inept and the pressure situation are on a collision course. The person who breaks under pressure typically breaks not because the objective stakes are unmanageable, but because the subjective stakes, what the outcome of this situation means for who I am, what I am worth, whether I am adequate or enormous. The external pressure has become internally catastrophized. It is not a difficult situation with high-stakes outcomes. It is a test of whether I am the person I need to be. The cognitive and emotional weight of this catastrophization is what produces the specific activation level that overwhelms the deliberate mind and generates the breaking behavior. The second feature of the breaking architecture is the absence of the regulatory practice that would govern the catastrophization process before it reaches an overwhelming level. Most people have not built the specific habit of noticing and interrupting this escalating chain of implication from the immediate difficult situation to the self-inept collapse that the difficult situation is interpreted as portending. Without this practice, the chain runs automatically, each link reinforcing the next, until the activation level has reached the point where the deliberate mind cannot access the brakes it would need to slow the process. The third feature is the absence of the experience base that would provide evidence against the catastrophization. The person who has navigated many genuine pressure situations and has a record of remaining functional in them carries with them the evidence that the current pressure situation, while genuinely demanding, is manageable, that they have managed things at least this demanding before and emerged with their essential functioning intact. This evidence-based grounding does not prevent the activation. It moderates the catastrophization chain by providing a specific counter-narrative. This is difficult, and I have navigated difficult things before. The person who lacks this experience base, or who has not attended to and integrated the evidence of their own functioning under pressure, lacks that counter-narrative. Each new pressure situation arrives as potentially unprecedented, as the ultimate test rather than the next in a series that they have evidence of managing. Why the braking pattern is so consistent across so many people in so many different pressure situations is explained by the universality of the underlying mechanism. The catastrophization chain is not an idiosyncratic pathology. It is the default operation of a system that was shaped by an environment in which high-stakes situations were genuinely threatening to survival and social standing, in which the full activation response was appropriate to the genuine urgency of those situations, and in which the specific moderating architecture described in this audiobook was not part of the ordinary developmental experience. The modern pressure situation is genuinely different from the pressure situations the system was calibrated for. The stakes are still high, sometimes very high, but they are rarely the immediate physical and social stakes that the full activation response was designed for. The appropriate level of activation for the career crisis, the public performance, the difficult conversation, is significantly lower than the level the system automatically produces, and the specific practices that moderate the gap between the automatic response and what the situation actually requires are not automatic, they are built. The building begins with this recognition: the braking is not a character flaw. It is a gap between the architecture available and the architecture required. The gap can be closed. The architecture can be built. And the first element of building it is the honest recognition of what, specifically, is failing when the braking occurs. The self-concept dependency, the absence of regulatory practice, the underdeveloped experience base, these are not permanent features. They are the current state of an architecture that was never specifically developed for the demands of genuine modern pressure. The 10 chapters of this audiobook develop it, layer by layer, beginning with what the built architecture actually produces and why it is worth building. Chapter 2: The Hidden Power of Staying Calm. The calmest person in the room often has the most control. The calmest person in the room is not always the person with the least at stake. Often they are the person with the most at stake, but with something that the less calm people in the room do not have: consistent access to a cognitive quality that pressure ordinarily prevents. This is the hidden dimension of calm that most people miss when they observe it in others. They see the composed behavior and attribute it to the circumstances. The composed person must be less invested, less concerned, less aware of the genuine gravity of the situation. This attribution is almost always wrong. The composed person is typically fully aware of the gravity. What they have that others do not is not lower stakes, but higher regulatory capacity, the specific ability to remain in the deliberate cognitive mode while the activation is present, rather than being moved by the activation from the deliberate mode to the reactive one. The power of this capacity is not primarily social, though social power is one of its consequences. The primary power is cognitive. The deliberate mode produces qualitatively better thinking than the reactive mode, and the gap between the two modes is widest under pressure, precisely the conditions in which the quality of thinking matters most. The specific cognitive advantages of the calm state under pressure can be mapped with precision. The first is perceptual breadth. The calm person is attending to the full situation while the activated person is attending to the threat. This is not a metaphor, it is the description of a genuine neurological difference. The stress activation response narrows attention toward the perceived threat and away from the broader situational context. The calm, regulated state maintains the broader attentional field, which means the calm person is working with a fuller picture of the situation than the activated person, even when both have access to the same information. The fuller picture produces better assessments. The better assessments produce better choices. The better choices, made consistently across many pressure situations, produce the outcomes that others attribute to advantage, luck, or special capability when the actual source is the consistently broader attentional field that the regulated state maintains and the activated state forecloses. The second cognitive advantage is option visibility. The activated cognitive state produces a narrowed option set, the most obvious, most automatic, most urgency-consistent options are visible, and the less immediate options are attentionally suppressed. The calm state maintains the full option range, including the options that are not immediately obvious, which are very often the most effective options available. The person who chose the unexpected approach, the counterintuitive move, the response that the situation did not seem to call for but that turned out to be exactly right, this person is frequently the person who was in the calm state when the choice was made, because the calm state was the only cognitive mode in which the unexpected option was visible. The activated person never considered it, not because it was unavailable in the information environment, but because the activated mode had already foreclosed the part of the option space where it lived. The third cognitive advantage is consequence depth, the ability to model the downstream implications of choices further into the future. The activated state compresses the consequence horizon. It evaluates choices primarily against their immediate effects and discounts medium and long-term implications. The calm state maintains the fuller consequence evaluation, which produces choices calibrated to the actual full consequence profile rather than to the immediate term only. These three advantages, perceptual breadth, option visibility, consequence depth, compound. The calm person is working with a bigger picture, more options, and a longer consequence horizon simultaneously. The activated person is working with all three of these compressed simultaneously. The quality gap between these two cognitive conditions is enormous, and it is widest at the highest levels of pressure when both the size of the gap and the importance of the thinking quality are at their maximum. Why calm is perceived as power. The social dimension is a consequence of the cognitive reality rather than a separate phenomenon. The person who consistently produces better thinking under pressure tends to produce better outputs. And better outputs, consistently observed, produce the social assessment of capability and reliability that respect and authority follow from. Others do not always understand the mechanism. They observe the consistent quality of performance under pressure. Note the composure from which that performance emerges, and register the composure as the quality associated with the performance. This is accurate that composure is not decorative. It is functional, the condition from which the better performance is produced. There is also a direct social mechanism that operates through the emotional contagion described in Chapter 5. The calm person in a pressured group is not only producing better individual cognitive outputs, they are influencing the cognitive quality of the group by providing a regulated state input into the shared emotional environment. The group's social temperature partially tracks the regulated signals of the calmest member, which means the calm person is producing a positive effect for the entire group's functioning. The hidden power of calm is hidden primarily because it is structural rather than performative. It does not announce itself. It operates through the consistently higher quality of cognitive and social functioning that the regulated state produces. Understanding the mechanism, seeing clearly what the calm state is actually doing and why it consistently produces what it produces, is what makes the disciplined pursuit of the calm state feel not like the aspiration to a social performance, but like the rational investment in a cognitive advantage that delivers real and consistent returns. Chapter 3. Your brain on stress. Stress does not make you stupid, panic does. Understanding what stress actually does to the brain, not in general terms, but in the specific functional terms that explain the behavioral changes that stress produces, is one of the most practically useful things this audiobook delivers. The changes that stress produces in cognitive functioning are not random or unpredictable. They follow a specific pattern, they are consistent across individuals and situations, and they are significantly more manageable when you understand the mechanism than when you are simply experiencing the effects without knowing what is producing them. The experience of cognitive degradation under stress is something nearly everyone has encountered: the inability to access information you know you have, the thinking that feels compressed and circular, the options that vanished when the pressure arrived, the response that was not quite right and that you would have easily corrected in a calmer state. These are not failures of intelligence or character. They are the specific functional effects of the physiological changes that the stress response produces in the brain, operating precisely as they were designed to operate, only in conditions where the design is counterproductive rather than adaptive. The stress response activates the sympathetic nervous system and the hypothalamic-pituitary-adrenal axis, the two primary physiological systems through which the brain translates the perception of threat into the body's preparation for response. The sympathetic activation produces the familiar physical changes: elevated heart rate, increased respiratory rate, heightened muscle tension, the redirection of blood flow toward the large muscle groups and away from the organs and systems not immediately needed for the survival response. These physical changes are preparations for action, specifically for the physical action of fight or flight. They are adaptive responses to the situations they were calibrated for. In the modern pressure situations that produce them, the high-stakes conversation, the performance evaluation, the organizational crisis, they are not adaptive. The elevated heart rate and the increased muscle tension do not improve the quality of the conversation. These physiological preparations are the body gearing up for a physical response to a situation that does not require one. The neurological changes that accompany the physiological ones are where the cognitive functioning effects are most directly produced. The amygdala, the brain region most directly involved in threat detection and the initiation of the stress response, increases its activity under stress and simultaneously reduces the activity of the prefrontal cortex. The brain region most directly involved in the deliberate, complex, multi-step reasoning that constitutes the highest quality cognitive functioning. This inverse relationship between amygdala activation and prefrontal cortex functioning is the neurological mechanism of the cognitive degradation that stress produces. As the amygdala becomes more active as the threat assessment intensifies and the stress response escalates, the prefrontal cortex becomes less active, less accessible, less capable of the complex processing that it uniquely provides. The thinking that becomes available to the stressed person is simpler, faster, more automatic, and more reactive, the thinking of the amygdala dominant state rather than the prefrontal dominant deliberate mode. This mechanism explains the distinction in the chapter hook: stress does not make you stupid, panic does. Low to moderate stress activates the physiological and neurological systems in a way that can actually sharpen certain types of performance. The elevated arousal improves speed. The attentional narrowing focuses processing on the most immediately relevant information, and the motivation to perform increases. The degradation occurs at the higher activation levels when the amygdala activation has suppressed prefrontal activity sufficiently to materially impair the complex reasoning that the situation requires. This is the panic zone, the activation level at which the cognitive quality has dropped below what the situation needs, and the behavior being produced is the output of the simplified reactive system rather than the deliberate complex one. The practical implications of this neurological understanding are specific and significant. There is a zone of moderate activation that is genuinely functional, in which the arousal is high enough to be motivating without being high enough to materially impair prefrontal processing. The goal of pressure management is not the elimination of activation, but the maintenance of activation within this functional zone, preventing the escalation from functional to panic. The second implication is that the physiological regulation practices that directly reduce the activation level, breath regulation, deliberate physical slowing, the engagement of the parasympathetic nervous system, are not simply comfort techniques. They are neurologically functional interventions. They literally change the physiological substrate of cognitive processing, increasing the availability of the prefrontal cortex by reducing the amygdala activation that was suppressing it. The breath regulation that reduces the heart rate and activates the parasympathetic system is producing real changes in the brain's operating state, changes that directly improve the cognitive quality available for the pressure situation. The third implication is that the timing of these interventions matters enormously. The earlier in the escalation from moderate activation to panic zone that the physiological regulation is applied, the less work it has to do and the more effective it is. The person who notices the early stage activation signals and applies the regulation before the amygdala activation has substantially suppressed prefrontal activity is maintaining a fundamentally different cognitive quality than the person who waits until the panic zone has been reached and attempts to regulate from there. Early intervention is structurally easier and neurologically more effective than late intervention. Understanding your brain on stress means understanding the specific neurological mechanism of the degradation, the amygdala-prefrontal trade-off, and the specific physiological practices that govern it. Not as abstract knowledge, but as operational understanding that makes you a more informed and more effective manager of your own cognitive functioning under the conditions that most demand it. The stress will come. The activation will begin. What happens next is not determined by the stress or the activation. It is determined by what you do in response to the early stage signals that the escalation is beginning. Chapter 4. The pause that changes everything. 1 second of pause can save you from a lifetime of regret. The pause is not a technique, it is an architecture. This distinction matters because it changes how the pause is understood and how it is developed. A technique is applied in specific situations where it is remembered and considered appropriate. An architecture is a structural feature of how the system operates present in all situations. Not requiring the specific decision to apply it, not dependent on the memory of its availability in the moment when it is most needed. The pause as architecture is the built-in interval between the incoming event and the outgoing response, the structural gap in the stimulus-response chain that allows the deliberate mind to engage with the situation before the reactive system has executed its output. This gap is where agency lies. Without the gap, there is no meaningful choice. The stimulus produces the response through the automatic channel. The deliberate mind is consulted too late to influence the output that is already in motion. The gap is the intervention point. The pause is what happens in the gap. The neurological basis of the pause connects directly to Chapter 3. The automatic reaction is the amygdala-dominant output fast. Pattern matched to past threatening situations, calibrated to the perceived threat rather than to the actual requirements of the current situation. The deliberate response is the prefrontal dominant output, slower, contextually accurate, calibrated to the full situation rather than to the threat assessment alone. The pause is the interval in which the physiological regulation can occur, in which the amygdala activation can be partially reduced and the prefrontal access can be partially restored before the output is produced. Even a brief pause, a few seconds of genuine non-response between the stimulus and the output, produces measurable changes in the neurological state that change the quality of the output. The heart rate that begins to reduce with the deliberate breath. The muscle tension that releases slightly with the deliberate physical slowing. The prefrontal access that improves as the amygdala activation begins to reduce. These are small changes from a brief pause, and they produce small improvements in the quality of the immediate output. But the cumulative effect across many situations, the many instances in which the few seconds of pause produce the slightly better response, the slightly less reactive communication, the slightly more complete assessment, is the compound return on the pause architecture that makes it one of the highest leverage practices available. The practical development of the pause architecture proceeds through several stages worth understanding explicitly. The first stage is recognition, the development of the ability to notice the early stage activation signals that indicate the reactive output is about to be generated. These signals are physiological: the slight elevation in heart rate, the slight increase in muscle tension, the specific quality of urgency that precedes the reactive behavioral output. In the fully activated state, these signals have already been processed and the output is already in motion. In the early activation state, They are available as advance notice that the reactive output is coming and that the pause architecture has an opportunity to intervene before it arrives. The recognition practice is the deliberate cultivation of attentiveness to these early signals that allows the pause to be inserted before the reactive output has been generated. It is built through consistent attention to the early-stage activation signals in the lower intensity situations of ordinary daily life, building the recognition habit until it is fast enough and reliable enough to catch the signals before the activation has escalated to the point where the pause is no longer available. The second stage is insertion, the actual creation of the gap once the activation signal has been recognized. This is where the physiological regulation practices of Chapter 3 are deployed, the deliberate slow breath that engages the parasympathetic system, the deliberate reduction of physical tension, the deliberate slowing of movement and speech pace. These interventions create the physiological conditions for the pause. They are not decorative. They are the mechanism through which the gap is opened and held long enough for the prefrontal axis to partially restore. The third stage is the assessment that occurs in the gap, the brief, deliberate engagement of the restored prefrontal axis with the actual situation, not the elaborate multi-step analysis that the pause does not have time for. The brief, accurate redescription of what is actually happening and what it actually requires. This is the use of the prefrontal axis that the pause created, the fast but deliberate assessment that distinguishes the current situation from the threat pattern the amygdala matched it to, and that generates the choice of response from the fuller picture rather than from the narrowed threat assessment alone. The fourth stage is the response, the behavioral output that the assessment produced, selected from the fuller option range that the pause made available, calibrated to the actual situation rather than to the amygdala pattern match. This response will not always be dramatically different from what the reactive output would have been. Sometimes the reactive output is actually appropriate, and the pause simply confirms it. What the pause changes is not always the specific response content, but the quality of the process from which it emerged, chosen rather than automatic, assessed rather than matched, calibrated to the current situation rather than to the historical pattern. The pause architecture is built through consistent practice in the ordinary daily situations that provide the training ground, the mildly provocative comment, the minor frustration, the small social pressure. The person who consistently inserts the pause in these ordinary situations is building the habit that will be available in the high-stakes situation where the reactive pull is strongest and the pause is most valuable. 1 second of pause can save you from a lifetime of regret. This is not hyperbole. It is the description of a real phenomenon entirely explicable by the neurological and behavioral mechanisms described in this chapter. The response produced in the reactive mode without the pause, without the prefrontal axis, without the fuller picture is the response calibrated to the amygdala's threat assessment rather than to the actual situation. The response produced after the pause with the prefrontal axis partially restored, with the fuller picture available, is the response calibrated to what the situation actually requires. 1 second of genuine pause is often all the interval needed to move from the first response to the second, and the difference between the two is sometimes genuinely life-defining. Chapter 5. Emotional contagion. Panic spreads faster than truth. You have been infected by other people's panic before you knew it was happening. This is not a poetic description of a vague phenomenon. It is the description of a specific neurological mechanism that operates automatically, continuously, and largely below the threshold of conscious awareness in all social environments. Emotional contagion: the transmission of emotional states between individuals through the automatic mirroring processes that the social brain is built to produce is one of the most consistently underappreciated factors in the pressure management equation. The mechanism operates through the mirror neuron system and the complementary limbic resonance processes. The brain continuously models the internal states of the people around it, using the observable signals, facial expression, vocal tone, postural signals, movement patterns to construct a representation of the other person's internal state and to produce, automatically and without deliberate choice, a partial mirroring of that state in the observer's own neurological system. This is the mechanism of empathy in its most basic form. It is also the mechanism through which a panicked person in your environment makes you more likely to panic, regardless of whether you have assessed the situation and found it genuinely panic-warranting. Panic spreads faster than truth because the contagion mechanism operates faster than the analytical process. By the time the assessment of whether the situation actually warrants panic has been completed, the contagion has already elevated your activation level, narrowed your attentional field, and begun to compress your consequence evaluation horizon. The panic is inside the system before the system has had the chance to evaluate whether it should be there. This temporal asymmetry, contagion faster than assessment, is what makes emotional contagion such a significant factor in group pressure situations. The activated group creates an emotional environment that continuously presses on every individual in it toward a corresponding activation state. And the pressure of the environment is operating neurologically before the deliberate mind has had the opportunity to evaluate whether the pressure is warranted. Resisting contagion in a group environment is not simply a matter of deciding to remain calm. The contagion is not waiting for the decision process to complete. Understanding the specific mechanism of emotional contagion changes the pressure management strategy in several important ways. The first change is the recognition that the activation you are experiencing in a high-activation group environment is not necessarily your assessment of the situation. It may be the contagion. The distinction is important because contagion activation is calibrated to the group's activation level rather than to the objective features of the situation. A group that has catastrophized a manageable difficulty will produce contagion activation proportional to the catastrophized assessment, not to the manageable difficulty. The individual who recognizes this can assess the situation independently of the group's assessment rather than treating the contagion-elevated activation as confirmatory evidence of the catastrophization. The second change is the specific protective practice of deliberate de-identification from the group's emotional state in high-activation environments. This is not cold detachment from the group, it is the maintained capacity to distinguish between your own accurate assessment of the situation and the group's current emotional consensus about it. The two are often different, and the difference is most significant at the moments of highest group activation when the group's emotional consensus is most powerfully pressing on individual assessment. The third change is the awareness of your own role as an emotional contagion source. The mechanism operates in both directions. You are receiving the contagion from the group, and you are transmitting it back. The regulated, calm person in a high activation group is transmitting regulated, Calm signals back into the group's emotional environment, signals that press the group toward the lower activation level in exactly the same way that the activated members' signals are pressing toward the higher one. The calm person is not passively holding their own state. They are actively modifying the group's emotional environment by the quality of the signals they are producing. This is the social power of the calm person in a group under pressure that Chapter 2 identified as one of the hidden dimensions of calm. It is the automatic expression of the contagion mechanism operating in the direction that the calm person's regulated state is driving. But it is real, it is consistent, and it is one of the most practically significant consequences of building the regulated state that this audiobook describes. The specific practice for managing emotional contagion in high activation environments has three elements. The first is the early recognition of contagion origin activation, when the activation began and whether it preceded or followed the increase in the group's activation level. The activation that followed the group increase is likely partly contagion elevated, and the assessment of the situation should include this recognition. The second element is the physical grounding practice, the deliberate recognition with the body signals, breath, muscular tension, posture that redirects attention from the group's emotional environment to the individual's own physiological state, which is the state that can be directly regulated. The group's emotional environment cannot be directly regulated from the individual. The individual's own physiological state can be. Attending to the latter rather than the former is the practical expression of the de-identification practice. The third element is the independent assessment, the brief, deliberate evaluation of the situation on its objective features rather than on the group's current emotional consensus about it. What is actually happening here, in terms that a calm, objective observer with complete information would agree on? And how does the group's current activation level compare to what that assessment warrants? The gap between the warranted activation and the actual group activation level is the contagion component, the activation that belongs to the group's emotional consensus rather than to the situation's objective features. Identifying that gap is the first step in not being governed by it. Chapter 6. The discipline of slowing down. When the world speeds up, the strongest minds slow down. Speed is the pressure situation's most consistent demand and most reliable trap. The pressure situation almost always presents itself as urgent. The stakes are high, the time is limited, the consequences of delay are presented as severe. This presentation of urgency is partly genuine. Some pressure situations do involve real-time constraints and real costs of delay. It is partly the product of the activated state itself. Urgency is a feature of the stress response, a quality that the activated system applies to the situation regardless of whether the situation's objective features warrant it. The activated person experiences urgency in pressure situations not only when it is genuinely appropriate, but as a general feature of the activation state. This manufactured urgency is one of the activation state's most reliably counterproductive features, because urgency drives exactly the behaviors that the pressure situation most requires avoiding. It drives speed, and speed in high complexity, high consequence situations produces errors that careful attention would have prevented. It drives the first available option rather than the best available option, because urgency compresses the option search and produces commitment before the option range has been fully assessed. It drives the reactive output rather than the deliberate one. Because urgency is the activation state's primary driver of the bypass around the deliberate processing that the pause architecture was built to prevent. The discipline of slowing down is the specific counterparties to the manufactured urgency of the activation state, the deliberate reduction of pace across the physical, cognitive, and communicative dimensions as a direct countermeasure to the urgency signal that pressure is generating. The physical slowing is the first and most foundational element. The rate of movement, the pace of speech, the quality of breath, all of these carry information both to the external environment and to the internal neurological state. The person who moves quickly in a pressure situation is not only expressing the urgency they feel, they are reinforcing it. The rapid movement signals urgency to the motor system, which signals activation to the physiological system, which maintains the elevated state. The person who deliberately slows their movement, who walks at a measured pace, who speaks at a deliberate rate, who breathes in the slow, full pattern of the regulated state, is breaking this reinforcing cycle and actively producing the neurological conditions that the regulated state requires. This is not performance of calm. It is the specific physiological intervention that produces calm as its neurological effect. The slow movement and the deliberate speech rate change the body's signals to the brain in ways that genuinely reduce the activation level, which genuinely improves the cognitive quality of the subsequent processing. The deliberateness of the slowing is doing neurological work, not social work. The cognitive slowing is the internal expression of the same principle, the deliberate slowing of the thinking pace in the pressure situation, resisting the urgency-driven compression that the activation state is producing. The pressure situation seems to demand fast thinking, but what it actually rewards is accurate thinking, and accurate thinking in complex, high-consequence situations is almost always slower than the urgency of the activation state would prefer. The cognitive slowing practice involves the explicit commitment to a specific set of thinking steps before any significant output is produced in a pressure situation. The description step, what is actually happening here, stated in specific, observable terms rather than the emotionally inflated terms that the activated state produces. The assessment step, what do these observable features actually warrant in terms of response urgency, intensity, and type. The option step, what are the available responses, including the ones that the urgency of the activation state is not naturally generating. And the selection step, which of the available responses is most likely to serve the genuine requirements of this situation, given the full picture that the preceding steps have developed. This sequence is not elaborate in the practiced person. It runs in seconds rather than minutes. What it produces is the specific cognitive quality of the deliberate mode applied to the pressure situation, the fuller picture, the wider option range, the more accurate consequence evaluation that the activation state was foreclosing. The urgency of the activation state was pressing toward the immediate, automatic output. The cognitive slowing practice produces the deliberate, assessed output that the situation actually rewards. The communicative slowing is the external expression, the deliberate reduction of speech pace, the willingness to pause before responding, the refusal to fill every silence with sound that the activated communication style produces. Activated communication is fast, verbose, and self-faust. It is the expression of the internal state rather than the calibrated communication of the assessed situation. Regulated communication is measured, economical, and situation Faust. It is the product of deliberate processing rather than the automatic expression of the activation. The willingness to be slow in a fast situation is one of the most specific signals of the unshakable quality this audiobook builds. It communicates, without announcement, that you are not being governed by the urgency the situation is producing, that your pace is set by your assessment of what the situation requires rather than by the activation state's default speed setting. Others observe this, register it, and assess it as a specific quality of person, the person who is not rushed by what rushes others, whose deliberateness is not hesitation but governance of their own cognitive process. When the world speeds up, the strongest minds slow down. This is the accurate description of the functional relationship between activation urgency and cognitive quality. The urgency presses toward speed. The speed degrades the cognitive quality. The degraded cognitive quality produces the errors. And the errors are exactly what the pressure situation was making costly. The slowdown is not merely resistance to urgency. It is the preservation of the cognitive quality that the urgency was destroying. Chapter 7. Common conflict. The person who loses control loses the argument. Conflict is the pressure situation that most consistently and most predictably produces the breaking behavior described in Chapter 1. It is the social pressure context in which the stakes are most directly personal. The outcome of the conflict bears on identity, on relationships, on standing, and in which the activation state's behavioral prescriptions are most directly at odds with what the situation actually rewards. The activation state's prescription for conflict is the escalation sequence. The perceived challenge produces defensive activation. The defensive activation produces aggressive or withdrawing behavior. The behavior produces reciprocal activation in the other party. The reciprocal activation produces further escalation. Each step in this sequence is the automatic output of an activated system responding to perceived threat with the social equivalent of the fight or flight behaviors that were calibrated for the physical threat environment. In the conflict context, this sequence produces the outcomes that are almost universally regretted in retrospect: the exchange that went further than it needed to, the position that was defended beyond the point where defending it served any genuine purpose, the communication that damaged the relationship in ways the original conflict did not require. The person who loses control loses the argument is not a statement about social dynamics. It is a statement about cognitive quality. The person who has escalated to the point where the activation state is substantially governing their behavior is producing outputs calibrated to the activation state rather than to the actual requirements of the conflict, to what it is actually about and what resolution would actually serve. They are arguing against their own interests because their interests are not served by the escalation. They are served by the clear, accurate articulation of their actual position and the genuine assessment of the other party's position that resolution requires. The calm person in the conflict is not less engaged with the substance. They may be more engaged because they are actually attending to the substance rather than to the management of the activation state. What they are not doing is allowing the activation state to govern the communication, to set the pace, the volume, the level of attack, the degree of distortion of the other party's position that the defensive activation produces. The calm communication is more accurate, more honest, more actually directed at the genuine issues, and more likely to produce the resolution or the understanding that the conflict was, at its core, about. The specific practice of calming conflict has several distinct elements that operate at different levels of the conflict dynamic. The first element is the physiological regulation, the application of the breath and physical slowing practices before, during, and after the activated moments of the conflict. The conflict will produce activation. The activation will press toward escalation. The physiological regulation is the continuous counterpressure, the ongoing practice of reducing the activation level that the conflict is continuously elevating. This regulation does not prevent the activation from occurring. It prevents it from reaching the level at which it substantially impairs the prefrontal axis that the quality of conflict communication requires. The second element is the content discipline, the specific cognitive practice of maintaining the discussion on the actual substantive issues rather than being drawn into the relational escalation that the activation state is driving toward. Conflict escalation moves from substance to relationship, from the specific disagreement to the broader character of the person holding the disagreed with position, from the specific issue to the pattern of behavior that the issue is interpreted as expressing. Each step in this movement away from substance is a step toward the captivation serving, resolution preventing territory that makes conflicts more damaging than they need to be. The content discipline is the consistent redirection back to the specific, substantive, and resolvable. What specifically is the issue here, and what specifically would constitute a resolution? This redirection does not require the dismissal of the relational dimension. The relational context is often genuinely relevant and may need to be addressed. It requires that the relational dimension be addressed specifically and honestly rather than being used as escalation fuel that the activation state is converting it into. The third element is the adversarial empathy practice, the deliberate, genuine attempt to accurately model the other party's position, what they actually think, what they actually want, what they actually experience as the problem, independently of whether that position is correct or those wants are warranted. The activation state produces a distorted model of the other party. Their position is more extreme than it is. Their motives are less legitimate than they are. Their experience of the situation is less valid than it is. The deliberate, accurate modeling corrects these distortions and produces the specific understanding that makes both effective communication and genuine resolution more achievable. The adversarial empathy practice is not sympathy. It does not require the concession that the other party is right. It requires the accurate understanding of where they are, which is the prerequisite for any genuine engagement with the conflict rather than the activation state performance of engagement that the escalation sequence produces. The fourth element is the exit practice, the specific recognition that some conflict moments are not the right moment for continued engagement, that the activation level on one or both sides has escalated to the point where further engagement is more likely to produce escalation than resolution. This is not concession or surrender. It is the strategic recognition that the cognitive quality available in the current moment is insufficient for the conflict to produce something worth producing, and that re-engagement from a lower activation level will produce a more genuine and more useful exchange. Calm in conflict is not the avoidance of conflict or the performance of patience in the face of genuine difficulty. It is the specific quality of engagement that maintains the cognitive access required to actually navigate the conflict towards something useful rather than simply expressing the activation state that the conflict is producing. The conflict is fully engaged with. The activation is fully felt. What the calm person is not doing is allowing the activation to govern the engagement to determine the pace, the volume, the accuracy, and the ultimate outcome of the exchange. Chapter 8. Building Psychological Endurance. Calmness is not a personality trait, it is trained. The most important statement in this audiobook is also the most misunderstood. When most people observe a person who is genuinely calm under genuine pressure, not performing calm, not suppressing activation through effortful white-knuckling, but genuinely maintaining the regulated state in conditions that are producing activation in everyone else, they attribute the quality to personality. That person is naturally calm. They are just built that way. They have a different nervous system, a different temperament, a different relationship to pressure that they were born with rather than developed. This attribution is deeply mistaken and specifically costly. It is mistaken because the neurological and behavioral evidence consistently shows that the qualities of psychological resilience and regulated performance under pressure are trainable, built through specific practice and experience rather than delivered by biological endowment. It is costly because it produces the conclusion that the quality is not available to the person who does not already have it, which prevents the specific investment in development that would make it available. Calmness is not a personality trait, it is trained. This is not an optimistic assertion, it is an empirical one, supported by the consistent observation that people who have been exposed to the right kind of pressure experience across a long period the kind that is challenging enough to produce learning, but not so overwhelming as to produce shutdown, develop progressively higher psychological endurance. The professional in the high-pressure environment who has navigated many genuine crises develops a relationship to crisis that is qualitatively different from the person who has not. The difference is not biological. It is experiential, the exposure to and successful navigation of genuine pressure situations builds the specific architecture that makes subsequent pressure situations more manageable. The mechanism through which this building occurs is directly relevant to the training practice. Each time the activation is felt, the physiological regulation is applied, the pause is inserted, and the deliberate response is produced from the partially restored prefrontal axis. Each time this sequence is completed successfully, the neural pathways that support the sequence are slightly strengthened. The recognition of early activation signals becomes slightly faster. The physiological regulation becomes slightly more effective. The prefrontal axis restores slightly more completely. The deliberate response is produced with slightly less effort. This progressive development is not dramatic in any single instance. It is cumulative and consistent across many instances. The person who has run this sequence successfully 100 times has a qualitatively different relationship to it than the person who has run it 5 times or who has only understood it intellectually without practice. The intellectual understanding is the prerequisite. The practice is what builds the architecture. The specific training practices for psychological endurance can be organized around 3 principles that together constitute the training methodology. The first principle is progressive loading, the deliberate exposure to pressure situations at a level that is challenging enough to require the application of the regulation practices, but not so overwhelming as to produce the shutdown that prevents learning. The person who only ever trains in comfortable conditions never builds the endurance that the exposure to manageable pressure would develop. The person who is thrown into overwhelming pressure without the foundational practices cannot access the regulation sequence they have not yet built. The progressive loading principle finds the level between these extremes challenging enough, manageable enough, specifically productive. For most people, the ordinary pressure situations of daily life provide adequate training ground material if they are approached as training opportunities rather than merely as difficulties to be survived. The mildly provocative comment is a training ground opportunity for the pause practice. The minor frustration is a training ground opportunity for the physiological regulation. The small conflict is a training ground opportunity for the content discipline and the adversarial empathy. These ordinary difficulties are not interruptions of the training, they are the training. And the consistency with which the practices are applied in these ordinary situations is what builds the endurance available for the genuinely high-stakes ones. The second principle is reflective integration, the deliberate review of significant pressure experiences, both the ones that were well navigated and the ones that were not, with the specific purpose of extracting the learning that advances the development of the regulatory architecture. The experience alone does not build the endurance. The experience plus the deliberate extraction of its lessons does. The person who navigated a pressure situation well, but did not reflect on how and why, has less to build from than the person who reflected specifically: what early signals did I notice? Which regulation practices did I apply, and how effective were they? What was the quality of my pause? What did the deliberate assessment add that the reactive output would not have included? These reflective questions close the loop between the experience and the architecture, ensuring that what was done well is understood well enough to be deliberately reproduced, and what was done poorly is understood well enough to be improved. The third principle is consistent practice, the day cover day, situation cover situation application of the practices in the ordinary situations that make up the substance of ordinary life. The endurance that holds in genuinely extreme situations is built from the consistent practice that ordinary situations provide. There is no shortcut to the high endurance state that bypasses the many ordinary instances of practice. The architecture is built incrementally, practice session by practice session, across the full span of the development. The person who has built genuine psychological endurance is not the person who found pressure effortless or was never seriously challenged by it. They are the person who was challenged repeatedly, who applied the practices consistently, who reflected on the experiences deliberately, and who accumulated across many cycles of challenge, practice, and reflection the specific internal architecture that makes genuine pressure genuinely manageable. Calmness is trained, the training is available. And the specific practices described in this audiobook are the training methodology. Chapter 9. The Silent Advantage. While others react, you observe. The observational advantage is one of the most quietly powerful and most consistently underutilized capacities available in pressure situations. In a group or social situation under pressure, most people are producing, they are generating behavioral outputs in response to the pressure, the verbal contributions, the emotional expressions, the decisions and actions that the pressure is driving. Each of these outputs is calibrated to the person's current internal state, to what the pressure has produced in them, to what the contagion has elevated in them, to what the urgency of the activation state is driving them toward. The person who is observing, who has stepped partially back from the production mode into the observation mode, is gathering information about all of these outputs simultaneously while producing none of their own. This informational asymmetry is the silent advantage. The information available to the observer in a pressure situation is qualitatively different from the information available to the producer. The producer is attending to the specific content of their own outputs and the specific responses those outputs are producing. The observer is attending to the pattern of outputs across all participants, who is most activated and in what direction, who holds the most useful information and has not yet produced it. Where the genuine tension lies beneath the stated positions, what the group is converging toward and whether that convergence is serving the actual requirements of the situation or only the collective activation state's pressure toward resolution of the urgency. This pattern-level information is genuinely more valuable for many of the decisions that matter most in pressure situations than the content-level information that the producer is attending to. The meeting converging toward a poor decision because the group activation state is driving toward the first resolution of the urgency rather than the best one is visible from the observer position before the convergence is complete. The intervention that redirects the group toward the better decision is most effective from the person who observed the convergence pattern rather than from the people who were participating in it. The silent advantage is built on the regulated state described throughout this audiobook. Because observation requires the regulation that most pressure situations are actively undermining, the activated person cannot fully observe. Their attentional resources are allocated to the management of the activation and the production of the outputs that the activation is driving. The regulated person has the attentional availability for the observer position because the regulation has reduced the cognitive load of the activation management, freeing the attentional resources for the broader situational perception that the observer position requires. The specific practice of the silent advantage involves the deliberate, occasional shift into the observer position in pressure situations, the partial withdrawal from the production mode to the observation mode, gathering the pattern-level information that is only available from that position before re-engaging with the production of the assessed, deliberate output that the observation has informed. The deliberate nature of this shift is important. The observer position is not passivity or disengagement, it is the specific, active gathering of information from the broader perspective that the production mode forecloses. The person in the observer position is not absent from the situation. They are present in a different and in some respects more complete way than the fully engaged producer. The observation is the work, and the output it produces the assessed. Pattern-informed intervention at the right moment is the expression of that work. Timing is the most critical dimension of the silent advantage practice. The observation position is most valuable before the group has converged toward a specific path, when the pattern-level information being gathered is still actionable. After the convergence, the intervention that would redirect the path is significantly more costly. The observer who recognizes the convergence pattern early and intervenes early is producing a higher leverage contribution than the same observer intervening late, even if the content of the intervention is identical. The timing perception, the recognition of when the observed information is most actionable and when the intervention is most effective, develops through the consistent practice of the observer position across many situations. Each time the observer position is occupied and the pattern-level information is gathered, The pattern recognition capacity improves. The early signals of convergence become more recognizable. The optimal intervention timing becomes more accurately perceived, and the quality of the pattern-informed outputs improves. The social dimension of the silent advantage is the specific quality of being the person who speaks less but whose contributions consistently redirect the group toward better outcomes. This quality is among the most specifically respected in any professional or social environment. The recognition that what this person says is specifically worth attending to because it reflects the pattern-level understanding that high contribution frequency makes unavailable. The person who speaks less but says more is building, through the consistent practice of the observer position, the specific quality of authority that cannot be manufactured through frequency of contribution. The silent advantage is available in every social environment that contains pressure, which includes most of the social environments that matter most. The investment it requires is the one this entire audiobook has been building toward: the regulated state from which the observer position is accessible, the attentional availability that the regulation produces, and the pattern recognition capacity that consistent practice of observation develops. These are all expressions of the same underlying architecture. The silent advantage is one of its most distinctive and most powerful social expressions. While others react, you observe. The reaction is immediately visible and immediately registered. It is the loud presence in the room. The observation is invisible. It is the quiet gathering of the information from which the most significant contributions are eventually made. The reaction speaks first. The observation speaks best. Chapter 10. Becoming unshakable. The goal is not to avoid pressure but to master it. This chapter is the integration, the point at which the 9 preceding layers are no longer separate practices but a single, coherent internal architecture. The architecture, in its completed form, is not a collection of techniques applied in specific situations. It is a relationship to pressure that is fundamentally different from the default relationship, the one described in Chapter 1, the one that most people bring to every high-stakes situation they encounter. That default relationship is characterized by the catastrophization of the self-connect stakes, the absence of regulatory practice, the experience of pressure as an external force that determines the quality of internal functioning. The built architecture is characterized by something entirely different: the experienced assessment of pressure as a condition that is genuinely demanding, that activates the physiological and neurological systems in predictable and no understood ways, and that is navigable with the specific practices that the 9 chapters describe. The goal is not to avoid pressure. Avoiding pressure is not available to anyone living a genuinely engaged life. The high-stakes situations, the genuine conflicts, the moments of real consequence, the crises that arrive without invitation, these are the substance of an engaged life, not interruptions of it. The person who has organized their life around the avoidance of pressure has not avoided it. They have avoided the situations in which it arises, which is a different and much costlier form of management. The goal is mastery, the relationship to pressure in which the pressure is no longer the governing force in high-stakes situations, but is instead the condition within which the built architecture operates, producing the regulated engagement that allows the best available performance to emerge from the conditions that are specifically designed to prevent it. What does mastery actually look like in the experience of the person who has built it? It is worth being specific, because the concept of mastery has a tendency to produce an idealized image that is both inaccurate and discouraging, the image of the person for whom nothing is difficult, who moves through genuine pressure with the ease of someone who is not really there. The person who has built genuine pressure mastery is not that image. They feel the pressure fully. The physiological activation occurs. The attentional narrowing begins. The urgency of the activation state is present and pressing. None of these are absent. What is different is the relationship to them, the recognition rather than the overwhelm. The early signal awareness that says this is the activation beginning, and the sequence that has been practiced many times is available to be run. The physiological regulation that follows the recognition, reducing the activation level before it has escalated to the panic zone. The pause that the regulation makes possible, creating the interval in which the prefrontal axis is partially restored. The deliberate assessment in the gap, using the restored access to produce the fuller picture of the situation, and the chosen response that the assessment generates calibrated to what the situation actually requires rather than to what the activation state was driving toward. This sequence, in the person who has practiced it consistently across many situations and many levels of intensity, does not feel like a 5-step process. It is the natural expression of the built architecture, the way this person engages with pressure situations, not as the deliberate application of a learned technique, but as the genuine expression of who they have become through the consistent practice the preceding chapters describe. The identity dimension of this transformation is real. Not the specific behavioral outputs of the practices, though those are real and consequential. The specific quality of being that has developed through the consistent practice and accumulated experience of navigating genuine pressure with the built architecture, the genuine, grounded, evidence-based relationship to pressure in which it is neither catastrophized nor avoided but engaged with as the specific, manageable, training-rich condition that this audiobook has been describing it as from the beginning. The unshakable person has pressure evidence, the accumulated record of having navigated genuine pressure situations with genuine quality that the person who has not built the architecture does not have. This evidence is not abstract. It is the specific memory of the crisis that was navigated without breaking, the conflict that was engaged with calmly rather than creatively, the genuinely high-stakes situation in which the deliberate mind was maintained when the activation was pressing toward its closure. Each of these instances is a data point in the self-assessment, not the inflated self-assessment of arrogance, but the accurate, evidence-grounded self-assessment of the person who knows specifically what they have demonstrated across specific conditions. This evidence-grounded self-assessment is the answer to the catastrophization process described in Chapter 1. The catastrophization runs on the absence of evidence, on the fear that this situation might reveal a weakness that is not known to be there. The evidence-grounded self-assessment interrupts the catastrophization with specific counter-evidence, not the generic reassurance of the positive thinking tradition, but the specific memory of the specific instance in which the activated state was managed. The quality of functioning was maintained, and the genuinely difficult situation was navigated with the quality that it demanded. These specific memories are the architecture's most powerful internal tool, the evidence that the capacity exists because there is direct evidence that it has operated. Building the evidence base therefore requires the deliberate integration of the pressure experiences that the built architecture has successfully navigated. not in a self-congratulatory way, in the specific, accurate, evidence-building way that acknowledges in that situation, under that level of pressure, the regulation worked, the pause was available, the deliberate output was produced. This happened, the evidence exists. And each additional instance strengthens the evidence base and weakens the catastrophization process that the evidence base is the most reliable counter to. Becoming unshakable is not the achievement of a final state. It is the ongoing development of a relationship to pressure that deepens with each practice cycle. Each successfully navigated situation, each deliberate integration of the experience into the architecture. The architecture does not reach a completion point. It continues to build, to become more reliable, more available under more extreme conditions, more fully the natural expression of the person rather than the effortfully applied set of practices. This ongoing development is not a burden, it is the expression of the engaged, high-functioning life that the unshakable quality makes more fully available. The pressure will come. The goal is not to prevent it. The goal is to be there, fully present, fully activated, fully engaged, and fully capable. Closing. The architecture complete. 10 chapters, 1 transformation. Not the transformation from a person who feels pressure to a person who does not. That person does not exist, and the aspiration to become them produces only the suppression of the genuine activation that genuine pressure warrants. The transformation from a person who is governed by pressure to a person who governs their response to it, who feels the activation fully, understands its mechanism completely, and has the specific architecture to navigate it with the quality that the situation requires. Chapter 1 established the foundational understanding. Pressure reveals what is there. The breaking architecture, the self-inept dependency on external conditions, the absence of regulatory practice, the underdeveloped experience base is not a character flaw. It is a gap between the architecture available and the architecture required. The gap is closable, the architecture is buildable, and the honest recognition of the specific features of the breaking architecture is the prerequisite for building what replaces them. Chapter 2 established why the investment is worthwhile. The cognitive advantages of the calm state under pressure: perceptual breadth, option visibility, consequence depth are genuine and significant, and they compound. The calm person is working with a bigger picture, more options, and a longer consequence horizon simultaneously. The activated person is working with all three of these compressed simultaneously. The quality gap between these two cognitive conditions is widest at the highest levels of pressure, when both the gap and the importance of the thinking quality are at their maximum. Chapter 3 gave the neurological foundation, the amygdala prefrontal trade-off that produces the cognitive degradation of the panic zone. Stress does not make you stupid, panic does. The functional zone of moderate activation that is performance-enhancing without being cognitively impairing. The specific physiological interventions that change the brain's operating state and improve the cognitive quality available for the pressure situation. And the critical importance of early intervention before the escalation has progressed beyond the point where regulation can maintain the functional zone. Chapter 4 built the pause architecture, the structural gap in the stimulus-response chain where agency lives. The 4 stages: recognition of the early activation signals, insertion of the physiological regulation, assessment in the restored cognitive access, production of the deliberate chosen response, the progressive development from deliberate technique to automatic architecture through consistent practice in the ordinary training ground situations, and the high leverage instances where the pause produces an output dramatically different from and dramatically better than the reactive output would have been. Chapter 5 addressed the social dimension of pressure management, emotional contagion, the mechanism through which the group's activation level presses on the individual through the automatic mirroring processes of the social brain. Panic spreads faster than truth because the contagion mechanism operates faster than the analytical process. The three-element practice for managing contagion: origin, activation, recognition of when the activation followed the group's increase. The physical grounding practice that reconnects with the individual's own physiological state. And the independent assessment that evaluates the situation against its objective features rather than the group's current emotional consensus. Chapter 6 built the discipline of slowing down the specific counterparties to the manufactured urgency that the activation state applies to situations regardless of whether the objective features warrant it. The physical slowing as the neurological intervention that reduces activation by changing the body's signals to the brain. The cognitive slowing as the commitment to the specific thinking steps before significant outputs are produced. The communicative slowing as the deliberate reduction of speech pace and willingness to pause before responding. And the identity signal that deliberate slowness in a fast situation communicates the person who is not rushed by what rushes others. Chapter 7 applied the architecture to conflict, the social pressure situation in which the activation state's behavioral prescriptions are most directly at odds with what the situation actually rewards. The person who loses control loses the argument not as social observation but as cognitive description. The four-element practice: physiological regulation as continuous counterpressure. Content discipline as the redirection back to the substantive and resolvable. Adversarial empathy as the deliberate, accurate modeling of the other party's actual position. And the exit practice as the strategic recognition that some conflict moments require the pause of the conflict rather than its continuation. Chapter 8 addressed the training methodology. Calmness is not a personality trait. It is trained, the progressive loading principle, the deliberate exposure at the challenging and manageable and level that builds rather than overwhelms. The reflective integration principle, the deliberate extraction of learning from significant pressure experiences that advances the development of the architecture. The consistent practice principle, the day-cover-day application in the ordinary situations that are the actual training ground for the high-stakes ones. And the mechanism of the building each successful run of the regulation sequence slightly strengthens the neural infrastructure that makes the next run slightly more reliable. Chapter 9 named the silent advantage, the informational asymmetry produced by the partial withdrawal into the observer position that the regulated state makes possible. While others react, you observe. The pattern level information available from the observer position and unavailable from the production mode. The timing perception when the observed information is most actionable and the intervention most effective. And the specific quality of social authority that the consistent practice of the observer position builds, the person who speaks less but whose contributions consistently redirect toward better outcomes. And Chapter 10 named the destination mastery of pressure, not its avoidance, but the genuine relationship to it in which the activation is fully felt. The mechanisms are fully understood. and the built architecture is fully available to produce the regulated engagement that the situation requires. The identity transformation from the person who is governed by pressure to the person who governs their response to it. The evidence base that the successful navigation of genuine pressure situations builds, and its specific function as the counter to the catastrophization process, and the ongoing development of the architecture deepening with each practice cycle, becoming more natural with each integration, expressed more fully with each successful navigation. The pressure will come. It was always going to come. The question was never whether you would encounter it. The question was always whether you would be the person who broke under it or the person who held, who continued to think, to choose to act from the deliberate mind in the conditions that are specifically designed to shut it down. The answer to that question is built, not born. You have been building it. The pressure arrives. You feel it. You recognize the activation beginning. You regulate. You pause. You assess. You respond. From the deliberate mind. Every time. Under any pressure. Unshakable.